The night he vanished felt like the city held its breath. A storm rolled over Boston, and the streetlights shook in the wind. In a small apartment, a white-haired man in a dark coat stood by the door listening. His name was Whitey Bulger. His suitcase was already by his feet. Cash was hidden in the lining. The TV buzzed softly, showing a quiet talk show no one watched. He looked at the clock, then at the hallway, then turned the doorknob. Outside, a car idled with the lights off. He stepped into the dark and closed the door without a sound. By the time the first police siren wailed 3 blocks away, the car was gone. Boston would wake up asking the same question. How did Whitey know to run? Who warned him? To understand that moment, you need to know who Whitey was and how he got so strong. He grew up in South Boston, in tight streets where neighbors knew each other's names and kids played ball by brick walls. As a boy, he learned 2 rules: protect your own and never look weak. When he got older, he started running with tougher crowds. He learned how to watch a room, how to whisper threats, and how to make people afraid without raising his voice. He didn't start big. No one does. But little by little, he built a crew that would become the Winter Hill Gang. Power changes how people move around you. Shop owners nodded too fast. Men who brag at bars stopped talking when he walked in. If he wanted a favor, folks found a way to say yes. Still, power brings danger. Other gangs wanted what he had. The police wanted him too. That is where the strangest part comes in, a friendship from the old neighborhood. A kid he knew from the block grew up to become an FBI agent. His name was John Connolly. The 2 men met again years later, one with a badge, the other with a hard smile. In quiet meetings, away from bright windows, they made a deal that felt like a handshake and a secret. Whitey would share tips about the Italian mob. In return, he believed he would be left alone. It sounded neat on paper. In real life, it was messy. People noticed. Rivals said Whitey was untouchable. Some thought the law was bending around him like heat around a flame. Bad things happened to people who crossed him. Many were too scared to talk, and those who talked were not believed. Whitey walked the streets like he owned them, but he also felt the ground shaking under his shoes. He was always listening, to doors, to phones, to the way a friend's voice might wobble on a word. Betrayal hides in tiny sounds. Then the pressure grew. Investigations thickened like fog. A grand jury formed. Names were typed on quiet lists. In offices with humming lights, agents pinned photos to corkboards and drew lines between faces. Something big was coming, and it had a date. Whitey heard whispers. He was careful with whispers. One night the phone rang. It was a short call, the kind that burns a hole in your pocket. The message was simple. They were coming. Maybe not tomorrow morning. Maybe not next week. But soon. Very soon. He looked around his apartment. The pictures on the wall. The long shadows. Life had been loud for so long, but in that moment it was all silence. He packed fast, neat, calm, like a man tying his shoes before a long walk. He didn't shout. He didn't run inside the room. He just moved. He left the TV on, as if he had stepped into the kitchen for a glass of water. On the street, the wind pulled at his coat. A car door opened. He slid in. The driver kept his eyes forward. The car rolled away. Hours later, black SUVs slid to the curb. FBI! Boots slammed up the stairs. A battering ram hit the door. It burst open like a drum. Agents poured in, guns low, eyes sharp. The TV still hummed. A tea mug sat warm on the table. The bed was made. The closet was half empty. There was no man in the chair, no suitcase by the door, no white-haired figure in a dark coat. Only the sound of the storm and the hiss of the screen. Whitey Bulger was gone, vanished into the night, and someone somewhere had helped him disappear. And then an agent shouted from the bedroom, holding up a small notebook he'd found under the mattress. The notebook was thin, with a cracked leather cover and faded pages. Inside were names, numbers, and strange markings that made no sense at first glance. The agent turned the pages slowly, his brow tightening. It wasn't a diary, it was a record. Every name in it belonged to someone with power. Politicians, cops, and men who had long claimed they'd never met Whitey Bulger. The discovery made the room feel smaller. Someone whispered. He knew everything. As news spread through the FBI office, tension grew. They had been watching Whitey for months, maybe years, but he had slipped through their fingers like smoke. The press soon called it the biggest embarrassment in FBI history. But behind closed doors, whispers were louder than headlines. Some agents believed Whitey had been warned by someone inside. Meanwhile, across the country, a white-haired man with a baseball cap walked through an airport in California. No one looked twice. He kept his head down, his steps slow. He was a ghost now, moving through crowds like any other old man. His partner, Catherine, followed behind, carrying a small bag. They had cash, new names, and a plan. For the first time in decades, Whitey had no soldiers, no guns, no crew, just fear and freedom. He rented a small apartment by the beach under a false name. The walls were pale, the furniture cheap, but he liked it that way. He could hear the ocean at night. The sound reminded him of the harbor back in Boston, before everything turned dark. Sometimes he'd walk along the shore, wearing sunglasses and a windbreaker, pretending to be just another retiree watching seagulls. But old habits don't die. He'd still glance at every reflection in the window, every shadow that lingered too long. Back in Boston, the FBI dug deeper into the notebook. They found phone numbers linking to John Connolly, the same agent who once protected Whitey. When investigators confronted Connolly, his calm face cracked. He had believed in loyalty, in helping the neighborhood boy who made it big. But now, the world saw him as the man who betrayed the badge. It was the fall of a friendship that had ruled Boston's underworld for years. The Irish mob, the Winter Hill Gang, began to crumble. Without Whitey, fear no longer kept men quiet. Old partners turned into witnesses. Some vanished. Some ended up in rivers. Whitey read the news from his hiding place. He knew what it meant. Every day he stayed free. The noose around his old empire grew tighter. The streets that once whispered his name now spoke like a curse. And the FBI wasn't giving up. They had new agents, new faces, people who didn't owe him anything. Years passed, and the world forgot him. New crimes filled the headlines. New faces ruled the news. But in a small apartment in Santa Monica, an old man still double-locked his doors every night. He watched crime shows on TV, half amused, half haunted. He'd say to himself, "They'll never find me." But the truth was catching up. A woman who lived in his building noticed something strange. The quiet old man upstairs looked too familiar. She had seen his face once before, on a crime documentary. She called the police, unsure she was right. The tip made its way to the FBI, where one young agent's eyes widened. Could this really be him? After 16 years? Early the next morning, the sun was barely up when dark vehicles surrounded the apartment building. Agents moved in silence. One knocked softly on his door. No answer. Another agent reached for the knob. Unlocked. The door creaked open, and inside sat the man who had once ruled Boston. His white hair was thinner now, his face lined and tired. On the TV, an old mob movie played softly. Whitey looked up at them and smiled faintly. "Took you long enough," he said. The agents exchanged glances. For years he had vanished, and now, just like that, he was back in their hands. But as they let him out in handcuffs, cameras flashing, one of the agents whispered to another, "You ever think he let us find him?" The other agent frowned. Why would he? Whitey smiled again, just before ducking into the police car. Because maybe, just maybe, the end of the Irish mob wasn't written yet. And that's when a gunshot echoed from a nearby alley. The agents froze. The echo of the gunshot bounced off the concrete walls, then faded into silence. For a split second, no one moved. The flash of red and blue lights blurred against the pale morning sun. One agent drew his weapon and shouted, "Cover him!" Another ran toward the alley. But when they turned the corner, there was nothing. No shooter, no shadow, just a fluttering newspaper on wet pavement. Whitey sat quietly in the back of the police car, his hands cuffed, his face unreadable. The corner of his mouth twitched like a smirk. "Told you," he muttered under his breath. The agents hustled him into a secure van and sped away. As the sirens wailed down the freeway, one thought burned in every mind. Someone had tried to end this before he could talk, because if Whitey started talking, too many powerful people might fall. When they landed him in the federal courthouse, reporters swarmed like bees. Flashbulbs popped, voices shouted his name, but Whitey didn't blink. Inside the courtroom, silence fell as he entered in chains. Across the room sat faces from his past. Old friends, former allies, people who had once laughed with him and now stared with disgust. The judge read the charges. Murder, extortion, conspiracy, racketeering. A lifetime of crime laid out in black and white. But for the victims' families, the courtroom wasn't about law. It was about ghosts. Mothers and brothers stared at the man who had stolen their loved ones. Whitey didn't apologize. He didn't look away either. When a prosecutor called him a coward, he only smiled and said, "I survived longer than any of you wanted." The room gasped. Outside, the news declared it the end of the Irish mob. The empire Whitey had built for decades was finally broken. Its soldiers jailed, its leaders gone, its secrets exposed. Yet even in defeat, he carried an air of control, like a man who still had cards left to play. In 2013, the verdict came, guilty on 31 counts. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms plus 5 years, a punishment so long it might as well have been forever. As guards led him away, someone in the crowd shouted, "You'll die in prison." Whitey didn't turn around. "We all do," he replied softly. He was sent to several prisons before ending up at Hazleton Federal Penitentiary in West Virginia, a violent place even among criminals. He was 89, frail, nearly blind, but still sharp. Some inmates whispered that he bragged about his past, while others said he kept to himself. On a cold October morning in 2018, guards making their rounds noticed his cell door was oddly quiet. When they looked inside, they froze. Whitey Bulger was slumped in his wheelchair, lifeless, his face battered, blood staining the sheets. He had been attacked, beaten with a lock inside a sock. By the time they found him, it was too late. News broke within minutes. Whitey Bulger, the notorious Boston mob boss, found dead in prison. Officials called it a random act of inmate violence, but few believed it. Too many people had reasons to want him silenced. Some said it was revenge for what he'd done. Others whispered it was to keep his secrets buried forever. Back in Boston, the streets buzz again, old men in coffee shops, women by corner stores, everyone talking. He got what was coming. One said, "No." Another replied, "He took too many truths with him." And maybe that's what haunted America most. Whitey's death wasn't just the end of a criminal. It was a final chapter of a story built on power, betrayal, and silence. The Irish mob had fallen, but the questions never did, because no one really knows who killed Whitey Bulger. Was it revenge, or was it the same invisible hand that once helped him vanish? The truth, like him, may have disappeared forever into the dark.